Welcome back, scientists. I am Mr. Steier, and this is Mr. Steier's Classroom. Today, we are talking about the invasion of plants. We're talking about how plants can invade, and your goal today is that you can describe how newly introduced species can damage the balance of an ecosystem. Let's do this, scientists. Plants invade! So your goal is you can describe how newly introduced species can damage the balance of an ecosystem. And as we look at this picture right here in front of us, we can see that these plants have clearly invaded this ecosystem. So what we're looking at right here is this is Kudzu. It's nicknamed the vine that ate the South. So in order to understand this vine that ate the South, let's talk about some things that you may already know about. Weeds. What are some things that people do when they see weeds? Yeah, usually people try to get rid of them. They try to pull them out, they spray them with chemicals. They do whatever they can to kill weeds, whether it is in their lawn or it's in their farming field or it's on a golf course where inside of a sidewalk, they'll pull those things out. People try to get rid of weeds. Now, why? Why do we try to get rid of weeds? How do you think weeds interact with the other plants growing in those parks, lawns, or gardens? That is exactly right. They take the nutrients away from the other plants that are supposed to live there. So if you get a lawn filled with weeds, the grass is not going to grow very well, because the grass can't get the nutrients it needs from the weeds, this invasive plant that's not supposed to be there. And weeds can be invasive. There's a lot of other information that we need there. But just in general, we want to get rid of these invasive, these weeds, these things that don't belong, because they're taking away nutrients from what needs to be there. So in this picture, we're talking about this plants invade. And when you hear that, if you're like me, you imagine that it is this mass of things that is trying to take over everything. And in a lot of ways, that is true. We're talking about an invasive species or an invasive organism, and we're going to focus here on how it can damage an ecosystem. Sometimes a newly introduced species can damage the balance of an ecosystem. Kudzu is a plant that is native to Japan and southern China. People brought kudzu to the United States in the late 1800s. Gardeners planted it because of its pretty vines and sweet smell. Farmers planted it to help control erosion. But after kudzu was introduced, it began to crowd out native trees and shrubs. It has now spread throughout much of the southeastern United States. Kudzu is an invasive species. An invasive species is an organism that does not belong in a certain place and harms the environment. Kudzu grows quickly, covering other plants, utility poles, power lines, and even buildings. So when we were talking about the weeds and how they were interacting with what was supposed to be there, how do invasive species interact with the native species? So if it's a native species, it's something that is supposed to be there. It's native. It has always been there. It belongs there. It fits in that ecosystem. Well, here we're talking about an invasive species, and how do those two things interact? Well, we can look at this image and we can say that an invasive species may crowd out a native species. if I look in my image up here in the center of the page, it looks like there's a tree that is completely covered in kudzu. So if this kudzu is covering up this tree, how might it be harming the tree? Yes, leaning on my prior knowledge, I know that all trees, plants, they need sunlight in order to survive. If this kudzu is all over this tree, it is possible that the leaves of the tree cannot get the sunlight they need to go through photosynthesis and make sure the plant can get what it needs, or the tree can get what it needs in order to grow and survive. So this kudzu could be doing some serious damage by blanketing this tree. Now, where does kudzu grow today? Well, kudzu is prominent in the southeastern United States. It is going to grow in areas that have a wet, damp, moderate climate, where it is warm a majority of the time. There's moisture in the air. There could be high humidity. But as you can see, kudzu has even started spreading like to areas in Michigan, up here into Massachusetts, into like middle to northern New York. And then it's starting over here on the West Coast. We're seeing it in northern and in southern Oregon. And so this map shows counties in the United States where kudzu has invaded. In spite of efforts to stop its spread, kudzu covers 150,000 acres of new land each year. So if we started to look at this map and think like a scientist and say, where is this going to spread to next? If it's covering 150,000 acres of new land each year, how much area of the United States could be covered by this invasive species in the year 2030? How do you think the amount of kudzu in the United States will change in the future? It sure does seem like, with the information we have, kudzu is going to continue to spread. Now, this is obviously dangerous for many reasons. What was the effect of bringing kudzu to the south? Well, when they brought kudzu to the south, even though it was planted to help control erosion, and gardeners planted it because of its pretty vines and sweet smell, even though it was planted for good reasons, it has crowded out the native trees and shrubs. It has done quite some damage. And as we know from our previous work in cycles and in food webs and food chains, if the native trees and shrubs are crowded out, what could happen to the birds and other animals that used to eat the leaves, the seeds, and the fruit of the native plants? Yes, if those birds and other animals do not have enough food, they are going to have to either move away or they might die. And anything that creates an imbalance in a food chain, in an ecosystem, in a food web, it will have domino effect repercussions down the line, which means everything in a food web, everything in a food chain, it has to stay balanced. If it doesn't stay balanced and we get these invasive species, dangerous things can happen. Now, sometimes people's actions have effects they did not intend. When people brought the kudzu to the United States, do you think they imagined how kudzu would damage the balance of the local ecosystem? Yeah, they probably didn't think about that. Most people likely did not consider how kudzu would affect the balance of the ecosystem. Now, remember what we talked about with weeds? A weed can be a wild plant that grows in a place where people do not want it to grow. A weed can be an invasive species. as we work forward today, you are going to use your scientific knowledge to make some inferences. So one of the inferences you're going to make is, how might daily life in the South be affected by kudzu? The other inference you're going to make is, when looking at this map, what do you think this map would look like in the year 2030? If this is what this map looks like in 2009, and we know that it grows 150 acres of new land is covered by kudzu each year, what do you think this map could look like in the year 2030? Now, in some of the extras today, you will learn about how people are trying to manage or deal with kudzu in order to make it so it is not so destructive to the environment. But it really is an invasive species, and its nickname, the plant that ate the South, is not an exaggeration. Especially when we look at our information, we look at the map, and we can see how this plant has invaded as much as it has. Now remember, today your goal is that you can describe how a newly introduced species can damage the balance of an ecosystem. Work hard, be a critical thinker. Thanks for being with me today. I'm Mr. Steier, and this is Mr. Steier's Classroom, and we will be together on the next one. Bye.